Heyo! Welcome to another Team SNG deck profile. Now today's deck is going to be Metaphys, and we're going to talk about pure Metaphys. The goal of this deck is to banish everything. Now, in the current meta, that's really good because a lot of decks now are really graveyard heavy. So, we've got things like Zombie World, we've got things like Orcust, we have things like Salamangreat, where stuff's all being sent to the grave, and they don't really do very well when everything's being banished off. And so this deck does a lot of banishing off, and obviously that can be a problem for a lot of different decks. It does have a bad Thunder Dragon matchup, but outside of that, it's pretty good. I took this to locals today, and I actually ended up winning locals, and I ended up having to play Burning Abyss Block Dragon Control, and I ended up playing Orcust Cyber Dragon, and I managed to beat both of them to win the whole day. I also played Zombie World and a few other matches as well. So this deck can do really well. It can be quite consistent. The one problem is sometimes getting going can be difficult, especially if your opponent has multiple hand traps, which can put you into a bad spot. So, as usual, at the end of the deck profile, we're gonna have a combo tutorial. So make sure you stick around for that, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And with that, let's get into it. So as always, we're going to start with the monsters. First monster that we're going to talk about is our main place starter of the Metaphys engine, and that is 3 copies of Metaphys Ragnarok. Now what Metaphys Ragnarok does is when it's normal or special summoned, you banish the top 3 cards of your deck, and he gains 300 attack for each Metaphys banished. So he can be quite good because he sort of gets cards banished off, and that can trigger Metaphys cards in the next standby phase. The other thing that he does is if he destroys a card by battle, then he gets to special summon a Metaphys from the deck. Now all the other Metaphys monsters, they have effects that trigger when they are special summoned by the effect of a Metaphys monster. So he'll trigger the other Metaphys monster's effect if he can destroy something by battle. So, the first big Metaphys that we run is Metaphys Nephthys. Now, Metaphys Nephthys is basically the Rhoda for the archetype. When this card's banished, during the next standby phase, you shuffle it into the deck and you search out a Metaphys card. She could also be really useful for dealing with back row decks, because if she's special summoned from a Metaphys monster's effect, then she will banish all spells and traps on the field. So, Metaphys Nephthys is your main searcher, but also your back row removal. The next one we run is your monster removal, and that is Metaphys Daedalus. If this card's special summoned by the effect of a Metaphys monster, then you get to banish all special summoned monsters on the field. When Daedalus is banished, you can shuffle him back into the deck to banish a Metaphys card from the deck. So this works really well with a card in our trap lineup, which we'll get to when we talk about that. But Metaphys Daedalus can be quite a useful card for setting up later turns. Now we also run 2 copies of Metaphys Tyrant Dragon. What this does, if it's banished, during the next standby phase, you can special summon a Metaphys card from your hand by shuffling this back into the deck. However, the real reason I run 2 copies is it's nice to be able to special summon this card using Metaphys Ragnarok to let you push for game. He's a 2900 beat stick who can't be affected by traps if he's special summoned by a Metaphys monster's effect, but also, if he destroys a monster by battle, or if he battles a monster, he can make a second attack in a row. And the final Metaphys we run is the baby Metaphys, and that is Metaphys Decoy Dragon. Metaphys Decoy Dragon is a phenomenal card for letting you recur your Metaphys monsters and trigger your Metaphys monsters on your opponent's turn. When this is either in the Pendulum Scale or the Monster Zone, this card has the exact same effect, which is if a Metaphys card on your side of the field is targeted for battle, you banish this card, and you special summon one of your banished or engrave Metaphyses to the field. Now, obviously this also has a banish effect. When this card is banished, during the next standby phase, you can special summon this card. So this card will keep recurring itself, and it'll help you recur your banished Metaphys. Now, all these Metaphys cards that special summon other Metaphys cards, they do put a stipulation on them, which is that the card special summon will be banished during the end phase of the next turn. So, you basically banish this off, special summon something back, and then at the end of the next turn, that card will get banished, and that card will then have an effect that triggers off during the next standby phase. So all the Metaphys sort of work together in the sense that they banish themselves off, or they banish other cards off, and then they trigger during the next standby phase, and they just cycle really, really quite well, if you can get them going. So that does it for the Metaphys lineup. Now we run some other cards, some other monsters that are sort of generic banish type monsters. So the first one we run is Necrophase. Necrophase is a pretty standard play for any of these banish.deck type things. What Necrophase does is when it's banished, you get to banish the top 5 cards of both yours and your opponent's deck. And it banishes them face up, so it'll trigger any Metaphys monsters that get banished with its effect. It's really nice when you Necrophase into Necrophase, so you find a way to banish off your first Necrophase, and then you banish your Necrophase with your Necrophase, because then that takes out 10 cards of your opponent's deck. That's usually a quarter of their deck. And you also end up banishing off a bunch of your Metaphys, which triggers a bunch of different effects on the next standby phase. So that can be really, really useful. Necrophase is also extremely useful for late game if you end up with a large banish pile. So today at one point, I ended up with, my banish pile was 26, my opponent's was 19. So that means that there was a total of 45 cards banished. Necrophase is a really great ability. When it's normal summoned, you shuffle back into the deck, into both decks, every single card that has been banished. And he gains 100 attack for each. So when I normal summoned him, and there was 45 cards banished, he became a 5,700 beat stick that was normal summoned from my hand. So, Necrophase can be really good in that sense because of the very simple fact, late game, it's a massive body your opponent has to deal with, and so Necrophase can be really valuable late game. Another card we run that can be quite difficult for opponents to deal with is Eater of Millions. This is really just for the problem monsters, the ones that are difficult to deal with. What you do with this is you banish cards face down from your extra deck to special summon this from your hand. And then what you do is it gains attack, 100 attack, for every face down banished card. And then if it battles your opponent's card, it banishes that card face down rather than going through damage calculation. So it lets you get rid of problem monsters that are on the field that maybe you just don't have an out for. So this can be really useful in that sense. Finally, we were on 1 copy of Gremaju. Now, I would kind of like this to be 3 copies. I think this would be a really good card at 3 in this deck, but I run it at 1 for now. I have lots of cards that banish stuff off, and Gremaju can benefit from that, but at the same time, it's not a necessity for me to have a big Gremaju. You know, I have the big Necrophase already, so on and so forth. So, Gremaju is useful. If I had a couple extra copies, I would run it, but I don't have a couple extra copies, so I run it at 1. You could run it at 3, and it probably wouldn't make a massive difference to this deck. You know, you might take out maybe a Metaphys here and there, or you might take out something from the cards I'm about to show you that finish off the monster lineup to run 2 extra copies of this. But you don't really need this. This is nice, but it's not a necessity. So we do run another banish.deck type playstarter, and that is Aloof Lupine. Now what Aloof Lupine does is, when it is normal summoned, you banish a monster from your hand, and then you get to banish a card with the same type as the monster that was banished from hand. Now, all of the Metaphys are lights, so there's no reason you shouldn't be running 2 copies of Honest. Honest is really useful in this deck because of the very simple fact everything is light. Finally, the last card we run, which is super clutch in this deck, and it came in handy all day, is 3 copies of Dimension Shifter. Now, Dimension Shifter is the best hand trap for this deck because it is great going first or going second, because it lasts into the end of the next turn. If you go second and you activate it on your opponent's turn, then your turn, everything will still be banished off, which means you can trigger Metaphys by banishing them off. That does it for the monster lineup. Alright, so we'll now get into the spells. The spell lineup is quite a large lineup in this deck. There's a lot of sort of consistency spells that help with things like draw power or hand fixing and things like that, because as I say, this deck can be really good, but you have to sort of have one of your play starters in hand to really be able to get going. And so what I like to do, what I have is quite a few consistency boosters in this. Now, one of the biggest consistency issues the deck has is that the monsters, Metaphys monsters, are mostly higher level. And Metaphys Factor is their field spell, which lets you sort of play around that problem. It makes it so the high monsters aren't necessarily breaks. And what it does is, once per turn, you can normal summon a Metaphys monster level 5 or higher without tributing. That card will then be banished at the end phase of the next turn. The other thing this does is it makes it so that your opponent can't react to your Metaphys monster's effects. We also run Azzy Metaphys. This is one of the first cards that helps you fix your hand. Once per turn, you can banish a Metaphys card from your hand to draw a card. And that's a really useful effect on your turn. The other thing is, once per turn, when a Metaphys card is banished, this card will do something based on whose turn it is. So if it's your turn, everything on the field except for Metaphys loses 500 attack and defense. And now it's a permanent debuff, and it can stack. So if you have 3 copies of this on the board, and the Metaphys card gets banished on your turn, everything on your opponent's turn loses 1500 attack. And so obviously that can be really oppressive. Its other effect, it can be a disruption type effect, which is if you can banish something on your opponent's turn, then all monsters except for Metaphys monsters will change their battle position. Now this can be kind of problematic with links, because obviously they don't change battle positions, they can only be in attack. So Azzy Metaphys is a really good control card in the sense that it debuffs your opponents, trigger your Metaphys cards that you want to trigger on your opponent's turn on the standby phase, but it also lets you draw a card, which sort of helps fix the hand. Now, we run some generic, banish.deck spells. First is 1 copy of D-Fissure. Obviously, super clutch. Any monster that would be sent to the grave is banished instead. The second one is Gold Sart. This can be really useful, because what I tend to do with this is I tend to banish off Necroface with this, and then 2 turns later I get Necroface back, so by then there's usually a pretty big banish pile, normal summon Necroface, so that can be really valuable. And then I also run 1 copy of Soul Release. And this sort of lets you get rid of anything that maybe your opponent got to get in the grave that has effects in grave. Or lets you, if any of your Metaphys hit the grave, then you banish those off as well. So these are the 3 sort of banish.deck staples that I run. Now another card that can be used to help fix your hand is Crossbreed. If you end up with 2 Metaphys cards in your hand, what you do is you activate Crossbreed, you banish both the Metaphys cards from your hand, and you get to add a Metaphys card from your deck. So Crossbreed can be really good for helping to fix your hand. As can both Pot of Duality and a German copy of Pot of Desires. Pot of Desires is really good. Eater of Millions, bait, 10 cards banished. Great for Necroface, great for Grand Maju. +2. We run a lot of 3-ofs in the deck anyway, so it's not like you're too concerned about banishing off everything of 1 card. But for the most part, Pot of Desires is a pretty safe run in this deck. The other one is Pot of Duality. Pot of Duality, you don't do a lot of special summoning on your turn. Most of the special summoning occurs on your opponent's turn, because a lot of the stuff that you do doesn't actually trigger until the next standby phase. So you're not going to do a lot of special summoning on your turn. So Pot of Duality is a safe play. It helps you fix your hand yet again. And finally, some more negation. Called by the Grave. I run 2 copies of this. You could run 3. Called by the Grave is really quite a useful card in the sense that it can stun out your opponent. It can banish their materials or any of their stuff off from the grave. And it puts you in a good boat because you don't mind that their stuff's being banished. You benefit off of that with things like Necrophase and Grandmage. So, that's why I run 2 copies of this. And that does it for our spell lineup. Now, this deck has a trap lineup. It's, again, like most of my decks, not very big. The first trap that we run is a Metaphys trap, and that is 3 copies of Metaphys Ascension. Now, this is 2 effects, but you can only use 1 per turn. So the first effect that it has is that you can discard a Metaphys from your hand, and then what you do is you draw the top card of your deck, and then you banish from the deck a Metaphys monster. So this can be really useful, again, for sort of fixing your hand and getting your Metaphys banished off that way. This has a much more useful effect, though, which is its banish effect. If this card is banished, what you can do is you can search out any Metaphys card from the deck. We run 1 copy of Metaphys Dimension. Now, I almost want to run 2 copies of this, but it is searchable with Metaphys Ascension and with Metaphys Nephthys, and we have draw power, which helps out. And also, it's not a mandatory type of card to have. Like, it's not a game-winning card, but it can be. What it does is, anytime your opponent special summons a monster, you can special summon one of your banished Metaphys. The other effect that this has is if you banish off a Metaphys, you can target a card your opponent controls and banish that. So, this can be useful for getting rid of problem cards again. Now, that does it for our Metaphys cards in the deck. We also, again, we run some hand repair. We run 2 copies of Waterfall of the Dragon Souls. Every Metaphys is a worm, so what you do with this is you can either activate it and search out a worm, or if you have multiple worms in your hand, you activate this, you send the worms from hand to grave, and you draw equal to the number of worms that you've sent, plus 1. And the final card we run in the main deck is Macrocosmos. Generic, banish everything, dot card. And that does it for the main deck. So, I have an extra deck. It's not necessary. You don't need it. You can play the deck perfectly fine without the extra deck, except for the very simple fact you need banished fodder for Eater of Millions. The extra deck kind of doesn't need to be here. So the first card we run, seeing as we run so many lights, 2-hit Potionnigan. Generic sort of light recursion. Everything light gets a boost. You know, it's your generic attribute Link monster. So we run 2 copies of him. Then we run a Nightmare package, because again, generic. 1 Nightmare Cerberus, 1 Nightmare Phoenix, 1 Nightmare Unicorn. Really, again, useful, but unnecessary. Now, we also run 1 copy of Topologic Zeraboros. Now, this is basically because banishing everything is so valuable with this deck. You don't mind if your stuff is banished. Your opponent probably does. So Zeraboros can be extremely valuable in that sense, but he's kind of tough to get into because you're not going to build up a board with 4 or 5 monsters. It just doesn't happen very often. The only part of the extra deck that I actually ran today, I actually used today, was the Utopia package. I got 1 Utopia number 39, 1 C39 Utopia Ray, 1 S39 Utopia Prime, and 1 number S39 Utopia the Lightning. Now I run some synchros because Metaphys Ragnarok is a tuner. The first synchro I run is HTS Siamoth. What it does is, if it battles a monster, banish this and that monster. Then we run Barlord Savage Dragon. Can be really valuable if you've used any links. Again, I don't really go into this, but it's here. And this can be quite valuable, especially if you have Defissure or Macrocosmos on board, because every time this is banished, it comes back. So that can be a problem for your opponent to deal with. Again, I don't go into it though. So the final card that I run in the extra deck, which makes up a total of 14, so there's one extra slot. Today I was running Borosword in it. Again, much like Zoroboros, no point. Getting into him is really difficult. But the final card I run is Metaphys Horus. Now, this is a level 6 synchro, and can actually be really useful in this deck, because the only way to get into him is using Ragnarok and Decoy Dragon. So when you use Decoy Dragon as the second material for Horus, you get 2 effects. You get his effect when an effect monster is used for him, and his effect when pendulum monster is used for him. The effect monster effect that he has is you can target a face-up card on the field and negate its effects. The pendulum monster effect that he gains is your opponent chooses a card and gives a monster and gives it to you. So he lets you steal stuff from your opponent. That's really the benefit behind him. And that does it for the actual extra deck. So, talking about this deck's combos can be kind of difficult. I think the best way to tackle this, and the way we're going to tackle this, is we're going to talk about some interesting interactions that can occur. The deck's versatility is the key to this deck. So, there isn't sort of a set combo like in previous decks. There's not sort of a endgame goal in the sense of you're trying to build this big boss monster, because more often than not, the best play you can make is normal summon Ragnarok and hope to banish off whatever it is you need for next turn. There are ways to sort of expedite the process, though. So we're going to talk about some of these interesting interactions. Gold Sark is a good card to start this with. We're going to talk about Gold Sarcophagus. You got lots of different targets for Gold Sarcophagus. Anything banished by it can be valuable to you in some extent. You can banish off Metaphys Ascension. You can get a search from that. And then you get your Metaphys Ascension back later. Or you can banish off Decoy Dragon to let you recur stuff, to recur himself, but also to make it so that if your opponent was to attack any of your monsters, you banish him off to bring something else back. So you can banish off whatever it is you really need. But the typical play that I tend to go for is I activate Gold Sarcophagus and I banish off Necroface. This banishes 5 cards from my deck and it banishes 5 cards from my opponent's deck. The deck is a total of, I think, 42 cards. So what you end up doing is, you mill an eighth of your deck to the banish pile. That'll trigger, hopefully, at least 1 Metaphys, if not 2. And the other thing is, you can also possibly hit Necroface. And I find it's uncanny, but I always seem to Necroface into Necroface, which then means you've actually banished off 10 cards, all for the cost of just activating Gold Sarcophagus. And as I said earlier, you'll get your Necroface back a couple turns later, which means the banish pile will be quite large, which means you're in good shape in that sense. So the next card, much like Gold Sark, that is a 1-card sort of play we're going to talk about is Aloof Lupine. Now, Aloof Lupine is really useful in the sense that you can use him to fix your hand, but you can also use him for other stuff. So one interaction is to banish off absolutely any of your Metaphys cards and Metaphys monsters, and in exchange, you banish off any of your Metaphys from the deck. The other interaction is to banish off Necroface. This will guarantee that you hit 2 Necrofaces at once. And that means that your opponent will banish the top 10 cards of their deck. That's a quarter of their deck. And you banish off the top 10 of your deck, and you benefit from that because you are likely to hit 3 or 4 Metaphys doing that. None of the Metaphys' banish effects are once per turn. So if you banish 2 Nephthys, that is 2 searches you get on the next standby phase. So that can be really valuable. I'm also going to talk about Metaphys Daedalus. If Metaphys Daedalus is banished, there are obviously several different cards that you can banish using Metaphys Daedalus. What I tend to like to do, though, is banish Metaphys Ascension. So you banish Metaphys Ascension, you get a search off of Metaphys Ascension, you shuffle back to Daedalus to use later in the game, and so Metaphys Daedalus and Ascension is effectively allowing you to run 3 extra copies of Metaphys Nephthys. So you basically run 6 searchers in the deck just with this little interaction here. So the final interaction I'm going to talk about is Metaphys Dimension. If you've got a situation where your Metaphys Ragnarok has been banished, which can occur, it's obviously not ideal because Metaphys Ragnarok is the only Metaphys that doesn't have an effect when banished, but it's not the end of the world. What you can do is with Metaphys Dimension, you special summon Metaphys Ragnarok when your opponent special summons something. That brings Metaphys Ragnarok back. Because Metaphys Ragnarok was special summoned, it banishes the top 3 cards of your deck. This is kind of where the RNG of this deck comes in, and where the true luck of this deck comes in. If you hit any Metaphys card with Metaphys Ragnarok's Banish 3 effect, by bringing it back with Metaphys Dimension, you get to banish a card your opponent controls. Maybe that's the reason you argue to run 2. But that little interaction can be really valuable, and it can steal you some games. Alright, so that does it for our combo tutorial. Final thoughts on this deck. Well, the deck can be really good when you play against graveyard-centric decks such as zombies or orcists, or when you play against decks that special summon a lot because you can board wipe them, or even when you play against back row decks. This is sort of a very versatile deck in what it can match up against. Also, it can go first or second with Dimension Shifter being in the deck. And it can be extremely valuable in the sense that your opponents will never see it coming. And a lot of people don't know what they do, so you can sort of play around people's ignorance. And while it can be difficult to get going, it can be quite a useful deck in the sense that it does have versatility, and it does have a lot of hand repair with things like Desires and Duality, and within built-in hand repair with Metaphys and Dimension. A lot of decks don't like their stuff being banished off. This one does, so this benefits in that sense as well, because you're just going to banish off everything using things like Dimension Shifter, Necroface, Defissure, Macrocosmos, all those sort of things will help you banish off everything and control the game that way. I like it. I think it's really fun. As I say, it can be really surprising. It'll catch people off guard. It can also be quite good, especially in today's meta where everything's sort of graveyard-centric. The one thing I will say about it that's really negative is that you need to be aware of what was banished the previous turn. So if stuff was banished on your opponent's turn, you have to remember to activate it in your standby phase. If stuff was banished on your turn, you have to remember to activate it in your opponent's standby phase. So that can be kind of difficult. It is a thinking man's deck. It's not a good deck to play if you're tired, or if you're not good at thinking sort of 1 or 2 turns ahead. You kind of have to be able to prepare that way for it. And in that sense, this can be kind of a complicated deck to play. But otherwise, it's quite a fun deck. It's quite a good deck, and it will catch people off guard, and it can be extremely powerful against graveyard-centric decks that are quite prevalent today in today's meta. It doesn't have a good Thunder Dragon matchup, and it doesn't really match up great against other decks that like to banish things off. Grand Maju decks will love playing against this. But for the most part, most decks these days aren't banish-centric, they're graveyard-centric, and this will hinder a lot of them. That being said, this can definitely win a locals. It did today. And it could possibly steal some wins at a regionals. I don't think it would win at regionals. It may make top cut. Maybe. That might be pushing it. But that's probably about as far as you're going to ever go with this deck. Because once people realize what you're trying to do with it, there are sides to deal with it. Yeah, so, as usual, take this deck with you, play with it, try it out. Let me know how it goes in the comments below. And I'll see you at the next profile. hope you guys enjoyed our Metaphys deck profile today. And as I say, I'll see you at the next profile. But before I see you there, if you enjoyed this, don't forget, hit that like button. Leave me a comment. Let me know you enjoyed it. Leave me a comment. Let me know you didn't enjoy it. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you would change. I am open. I want to know what you guys think of it. Also, if you really enjoyed it, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I like to see you guys at every deck profile.